This is a Geek Leader. Hey guys, welcome to episode 114 of a Geek Leader podcast. This is John Rowdy, your host, and today on the show, we're going to talk about Agile leadership. We've got Jeff Dalton, the author of Great Big Agile. He's also the Chief Evangelist at AgileCxO, and in his book, Great Big Agile, which I really love this book, it talks about all the things that leaders need to know about Agile project management, but Agile leadership, about building a culture, about trust. It goes into all the different types of Agile frameworks that are out there and get you a highlight about those things without going in too in-depth. That's confusing and difficult to understand. It's very easy to follow. Great pictures, great illustrations, just a great book. I highly recommend everyone pick up Great Big Agile, an operating system for Agile leaders. With all that being said, give it up for Jeff Dalton. All right, today on the show, Geek Leaders, we've got Jeff Dalton. Jeff Dalton is the author of Great Big Agile, which is an operating system for Agile leaders. And prior to the show, Jeff and I were chatting a little bit and talked about his passion for upcoming leaders, which is what we're going to really talk about a lot today. But Jeff, to get us started, do you mind giving the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you're at and where are you today?
No, thanks, John. Appreciate you having me on. It's funny you ask me that because when I was coming up in my career, I would get this question, of course, in an interview. And I have a kind of not a typical background for someone in our business. And I had to spend a lot of time sort of crafting the precise message because I didn't want my interviews to get off track when I was applying for jobs as programmers and managers and so forth. But my first degree was in music. And I actually grew up in a musical family that toured the world playing music. Think the Partridge Family, but unplugged. We rode around in a bus, and we lived a sort of the bohemian lifestyle until I was a teenager. And went to college for music, played in orchestras, and played music professionally for a whole bunch of years. And then in my mid-30s, decided that I wanted to try something different, and somebody gave me a really early laptop computer, really a luggable computer. Back then, it was this old CPM machine, had 8K of RAM, and I started playing around with it. And I realized that music theory and traditional music training aligns really well with software development. There's a lot of similar data constructs, a lot of similar concepts. And the discipline and the rigor and the creativity required to really be a great craftsman in the IT business was almost identical to what it was in the music business. So the transformation for me was almost instantaneous. Within a year, I was writing software for HP, and I was working for some other companies, and spent a bunch of years as a programmer, architect, moved up into technical leadership, became a director of product development, and then CIO and CTO of a number of companies, and started my own firm in 2005. And a firm was called Broadsword. I still own that firm. And it's a company that helps software developers and engineers and product owners be the best they can be, just be really highly skilled craftspeople. And about 2 years ago, decided to write a book about Agile leaders. I had already written a book about programmers and how they can succeed using off-the-shelf process models to really help accelerate their career. And so this book was about upcoming people who wanted to be more agile and people who wanted to be leaders, and organizations that really just wanted to embrace and become agile throughout the organization. So that book came out in December. And since then, it's been a whirlwind. I've been to Japan, I've been to China, I've been to India, I've been speaking all over the world. So it's been fantastic. But that's kind of the very short history of how I got here. And it's amazing how things come together.
Wow. Your story is really interesting to me because I have the guy that was actually the best man at my wedding. He had a musical background as well, and was a band director for, I want to say, like 5 or 6 years or something, high school band director, and then decided to get into software development, and now he's a principal Agile project manager. But it's very interesting to hear that stories. We actually had Roger Nierenberg on to talk about his book Maestro. We talked, and he correlated the way that leadership is a lot about music and conducting, and you have kind of like the orchestra, and they all kind of do their own thing, but you kind of build a framework around that. And I think you talk about that some in your book too, about self-organizing teams being a lot like an orchestra. Do you mind getting into how your musical background kind of helped shape your path towards this idea of self-organizing teams?
Sure. Yeah. So orchestras and especially jazz groups are really the ultimate self-organizing teams. Sure, conductors sort of facilitate. You can think of them as scrum masters, sort of. They facilitate the process. They help people get focused. They remove impediments. But every single person in that orchestra or in that jazz big band or jazz group is a highly skilled craftsperson. And we don't appreciate this enough in the business world. We don't typically think of musicians or professional musicians as being craftspeople, but they really are. People often say, musicians make good programmers because music is math. You hear that one a lot. Well, I was a programmer for a lot of years, and I didn't remember doing a whole lot of math when I was a programmer. Did a whole lot of logic. But that's not really the reason. The reason why musicians make great programmers is because from day one, musicians are steeped in excellence, quality, discipline, persistence, practicing, becoming craftspeople. And they have a feedback mechanism in music training they call the jury, which is your peers and your professors critiquing your playing. And they do this frequently. These are things we don't do in the IT business that we probably should. But when you've got 110 people on the stage that have all are finely tuned craftspeople, they're experts in their field, they all have 10,000 hours, they're all the top of the line players in their field. They're doing their thing, but they're doing it in concert with other people, and it's really a team environment. But there's nobody really telling them what to do while they're doing it. They know the content, and they know the process so well that they don't require any leadership. And this is why I say in my book that creativity lies on the far side of discipline. Excellence and to be able to deliver really creative, innovative solutions can only happen consistently if you have a lot of discipline and rigor and focus. You have these people saying, I don't have much training, but I created this great app. Well, that happens once in a while. But at scale, if you're trying to scale excellence and scale delivery, the only way to do it is to start with the same things that you start as a music student. Discipline, creativity, excellence, practice, self-awareness and improvement, and all of the things that you hear about in Agile teams. So this is why musicians make excellent Agile leaders, because not only are they finely tuned craftsmen, but they've learned those skills that are so important that are outlined in the Agile Manifesto and the set of Agile principles. It comes naturally to them, and they're really good at it. Current business leaders need to unlearn certain skills to gain those skills, because the skills that they've learned to become CIOs, CTOs, and directors have been antithetical to Agile values. They've been command and control. They've been highly controlled processes. They've been highly audited processes. It's been a very negative business environment. CIO Magazine just had on the cover this week talking about the state of IT leadership, and it was not a positive article. So, this is a big problem in our business, but leaders need to learn how to be more Agile leaders, regardless of if their teams are using Scrum or not. And part of that is mastering self-organization, and that's difficult for a lot of people. Yeah,
so could you explain in your own words kind of like what is self-organization? We hear that a lot. We hear about self-organizing teams. And, when you're trying to explain the concept of self-organization to someone who, let's say they have that kind of command and control mindset, and they always talk about, following the chain of command and, making sure you have your detailed requirements document up front and it's signed off on by everybody and everybody agrees upon it before work starts. All that mindset. How do you describe a self-organizing team that doesn't sound like chaos?
Sure. Well, self-organizing is one of those terms that's misunderstood almost as much as Agile is misunderstood.
Agreed. Yeah.
You talk to people about what is Agile, and half those people will describe chaos, and half of them will describe something else. But self-organizing is a highly disciplined approach to doing business, and so is Agile. But self-organization is a prerequisite to agility. So self-organization requires highly disciplined practitioners whose roles are crisply and clearly defined, not at the individual level, but at the role level. And inside of each role, each accountability is crisply defined. So everybody understands exactly what they're responsible for and what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to interact with other people. But self-organization doesn't happen by magic. There's a very strong governance infrastructure that has to be applied to it. Now, that governance infrastructure is very different than what we're used to today. But a typical self-organizing organization, it's a lot of organization words in there, I guess. A typical self-organizing company will have strong self-governance that is very structured. They'll have some sorts of loosely defined organizations that govern themselves, identifying the roles, identifying the accountabilities, identifying the interfaces between each of those, and then policing, if you will, or monitoring or holding each other accountable, if you will, for the execution of those roles. Now, one of the myths about self-organization is that they don't have any leaders. There was an article in Harvard Business Review recently about this that actually made that statement, says, how do you run a business without leaders? That's not true. A self-organizing company will have leaders. Those leaders will be roles that are defined that have very clear set of accountabilities and deliverables to the team. Another big difference is that leaders in a self-organizing company, instead of being command control, they are stewards and operators of a self-organizing architecture. That architecture includes all these roles and accountabilities I've defined, all the interfaces, the governance infrastructure, how accountability and peer review works, and all of the processes around running a self-organizing team are operated by these leaders, and they're responsible for operating the infrastructure, provisioning the teams for their success, and removing impediments for the team so the real experts can get to work. So that's really one of the big points of confusions about self-organization, is that it's chaos. It's the opposite of chaos. It's such extreme discipline that a lot of companies don't even want to do it. They try it and they're like, oh my gosh, this isn't for me. And that's true. Some companies just can't manage that. But for those that can, the rewards are great. But it's a tough road to get there, but well worth it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't equate discipline. They don't understand how important discipline is when you're doing something like a digital transformation or moving to an agile type framework. But it's extremely important to be disciplined, even when you're not seeing the results that you expect maybe right away. It's one of those things you have to stick with it for a period of time. At least that's what I've seen in my time.
There's no doubt about that. And you're talking about digital transformation or any kind of transformation. Our clients use the term agile transformation a lot. Most people don't think that that's like a major project that requires leadership and project management and discipline and reviews and designs and deliverables, just like you would have any project. And I sit down with my clients and they say, we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to do a transformation. And I say, do you know how to build a complex product? Do you know how to plan to build one? Do you know how to design solutions? Do you know how to deliver them? And they're like, oh, yeah, here's how we design it. And you train people and you do all this. And I'm like, yeah, that's now you're onto something, right? So a digital transformation is and this is big picture, but is really not much more than we currently use this product to run our business, and I'm using the word product loosely. It's really kind of culture and process. And we want to switch to a different product to run our business. And that new product is a new enhanced or changed culture and new processes and new tools. And I use the word product with them because they know how to build products. And if you give a product mindset to your transformation, the process you have to follow to get there is pretty obvious. Not easy, but pretty obvious to them because they do that every day in their real world.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I know I work at a place where we're actually going through an official digital transformation, and we're kind of like 18 months into it right now. And we started out with probably doing it all wrong, which I think a lot of people do. I think most people would probably start out doing it all wrong, but that's good. We learn from those mistakes, and it's one of those things that you can kind of evolve with. And we've recently within the last 6 months or so kind of shifted our mindset from talking about projects and process to defining things as projects. And once we changed the terminology, even though it's really the same thing, just by changing the terminology, the rest of the business kind of stepped on board. It's like, oh, we get this now. Whereas for the longest time, it's like, you want digital? Does that mean you're just like scanning paper? No, that's not digital at all. But it's kind of one of those things to get the point across when you actually change your terminology to fit what people understand.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because that's a conclusion I came to a bunch of years ago, that if you're going to ask technical people to change, you need to ask them to do it in a language they understand. And the first thing I did, the first little bit of change that I made to my business when I learned that was presenting all of the processes that we were asking them to perform in UML format, as opposed to like swim lanes or flow charts or process documents. And then we started drawing out behavior patterns using, design artifacts, various diagrams that were familiar to them. Every company's different, but whether it's UML or DFDs or, site, whatever sequence diagrams, whatever it happened to be that the company used, defining the behaviors we were asking them to exhibit in that format really helped them understand what it was we're looking at. And the other thing that I learned was, if you're going through a digital or agile transformation, why not use Agile to be agile? In other words, the program should be organized in sprints and releases and should have stand-ups. And I'm talking about the transformation program itself, right? Should have product, should have a backlog, should have every 2-week deliverables, should have a product owner, should have all the things that you would see in a typical Agile project. But the content in the backlog is items related to the transformation, right? Whether that's designing solutions, whether that's implementing tools, whether that's training people, whether that's coaching and mentoring, whether it's QA and metrics, whatever it is, build it around a product backlog that then is placed within the context of one or more sprints. And if you have multiple working teams, do a scrum of scrums and organize that way. So there's nothing like actually running it like an Agile project while you're trying to transform to Agile that really drives the point home for them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Plus, it gives you a kind of a better selling point that, see how this worked for here. It's also going to work for X, Y, and Z.
Right. We have a client that out in the West Coast, it's an aerospace company, and they wanted a bunch of help improving their performance. And they weren't Agile by any stretch of the imagination, but we used Scrum or a variant of Scrum to help them and work with them for 6 months or so. And then we heard from them about 6 months later, and they said, you know what, we watched how well that project went, and we've decided to change all of our software engineering projects over to that same framework that you used when you were helping us with our transformation. So you're right. If they, that's sort of a key, a key aspect of any kind of Agile leader is that they embrace the frameworks, they embrace the values, and they use them themselves. There's nothing like watching leadership embrace something to really inspire the rest of the organization to go along with it, as opposed to so many leaders today that tell people they have to be Agile or waterfall or whatever it is, but they themselves don't get involved. So that's a very big differentiator.
Yeah, I've actually sat in meetings where C-level executives have told groups that they need to be more agile, and then immediately ask for detailed requirements documents that can be signed off upon, and a Gantt chart of all the deliverables.
Right. It's like, be agile, and where's my Microsoft project work plan?
Exactly. Yeah. The exact opposite.
You'd be amazed at the companies that ask us, come and help us with an Agile transformation. And then when we get there, they'll go, okay, we're an Agile organization already, but here's our 900-line Microsoft project work plan that we put together for this project, and we're in the planning phase right now. And you just look at them kind of dumbfounded, like, seriously? I mean, what? So, yeah, that sort of thing is happening everywhere I look. And it's kind of what inspired me to write the latest book, because we did an assessment of about 200 companies over the last 10 years, and we put all the data together last year, and we found that like 195 of them said they were agile, but actually weren't and didn't know how to do it. So we said, let's write a book, a how-to book for young leaders so we can solve this problem.
Awesome. Yeah. So when it comes to, young leaders becoming more agile and understanding it, I think a lot of times we get stuck in that hard spot between, I've read this in this book, it's really awesome, but yet, my CTO or CIO or vice president says that, that's not going to work for our culture. How does culture play a role in that? And how can someone kind of in that middle management role kind of drive that culture?
Right. So Agile is a culture, right? A lot of people talk about Agile and what they're really talking about is Scrum or XP. And there's nothing wrong with implementing some techniques that might work fine for you. But Agile is a culture, and if you really trace back to the value of values, I call it the value of high trust, you can't have high trust in an organization when your leadership is a command control leader, unless that leader opens up and becomes more of an Agile leader. So it's very difficult for, say, a development organization in a company that is very command and control to really get benefits from being Agile. Now, they could get lots of benefits from being using Scrum or using Kanban or XP, but they're still going to kind of be stuck in that sort of black hole of distrust, let's call it, where they're Agile within their own four walls, but they're not so much on the outside. So I guess two things. I would say that the young Agile leaders need to push the envelope on both sides. So they need to push Agile upstairs. Very difficult to do. I'll admit that. It's much more easy to do an Agile, any kind of movement to Agile when your leaders are on board. But if you're not, definitely push the values piece of it upstairs. More high trust, more openness, more transparency. I would definitely adopt visual information management and make sure that our leaders are seeing that we're posting important information all around. In other words, show them that they can trust us, because that's really the issue, right? Is leaders don't trust their team, especially in IT. And part of that is because the business doesn't trust IT in a lot of organizations. And so there's a lot of pressure on IT leaders to not trust their teams because they're trying to cover themselves and for the failure of their teams. So one of the things a young leader can do is demonstrate their trustworthiness. And I know this sounds kind of weird, but trust isn't something that happens in a vacuum. It isn't something that happens. If I said to you, hey, you should trust me, you're going to be wary of that, right? You don't know me. I'm a voice on Skype, right? We haven't met face to face. You have no reason to trust me, so you are going to be more command control and more guarded. That's a normal human behavior. In order for you and I to have a trust relationship, we both have to demonstrate that we can be trusted. And in a business setting, it's not personal, it's professional. So how do you professionally demonstrate trust? Well, you do that by oversharing information in the right format. You do that by ensuring that whatever it is that you've committed to in a forecast actually happens. And most importantly, and I learned this from my Ernst & Young days, you are excellent at delivering bad information. So this is one of my favorites because I found that people that are good at delivering bad information excel well in companies because they build high trust relationship with their leaders in a way that you wouldn't if you didn't have to do that. So I think that a young leader should get really good at that, get really good at visual information management so senior leadership can get information about the status of everything without even having to ask anybody, so that they can come to learn that it's just out there in the ether, it's available to everybody, it's transparent. And I would say also invite your leaders to various ceremonies that you're executing. Invite them to sprint demos. Invite them to observe certain ceremonies, not participate, but observe certain ceremonies and techniques. So I would push that uphill that way. And then as far as the downhill side goes, in other words, the team members and the testers and the engineers, I would say young leaders would really benefit from instilling a sense of discipline and excellence in their teams. And this is done through training and coaching, obviously, clear, crisp definition of roles, accountabilities, ceremonies, and techniques, holding people accountable to those. And this really just getting people to agree and sign up to running a really tight ship at all times. And so those two things together ought to shake loose some interest in senior management. And at the very least, you're going to have a very highly productive and excellent team. And even if you can't get your leaders on board, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head right there. And especially when it comes to trust, I always say trust comes from transparency.
Right.
And it's I remember back probably, 9 years ago or so, maybe longer, at my last company, when I was a manager of a web and mobile development team, we had just started doing mobile development, and we were still very, very much waterfall. The whole IT department was very waterfall, and I knew we had to become more agile if we wanted to get things done and be able to take on mobile development as well as our web development pieces that we were working on. So I didn't really ask permission from my boss, but I told him what I was doing, and that I brought in an agile coach, and we were going to go through this process, and we were going to start using Scrum, and we're going to do it by the book, for the next 6 months and see what happens. And he wasn't really a fan of it at the time, but one of the things we did is we put up a website that kind of just showed reports of our daily stand-ups, and I had a person on our team that was responsible for entering in all that information and seeing what everybody talked about, what everybody did. And this is transparency that he doesn't have in any of his other teams. None of his other development teams are putting this stuff out there. They're just coming to their meeting every 2 weeks saying, here's what we did, or here's where we're at, here's our statuses. But now he could see a live update of exactly the things that we were working on. That was every day. What are our roadblocks? What is being delivered? We moved our release cycles from monthly to every 2 weeks to eventually every Tuesday. And it was kind of one of those things that he saw the results and then got on board and then moved the rest of the department there.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I mean, I think if you can demonstrate the actual benefit of it, and I think all those benefits that you listed are benefits you get from Scrum and XP without necessarily adopting Agile in the whole organization. So I think that's a great way to get them on board. But I will say one thing about that, the whole waterfall versus Agile discussion. It kind of reminded me when you said that. I speak at a lot of Agile conferences, and it's kind of like this Agile good, waterfall bad sort of mentality.
You hear that a lot.
Yeah, and I want to just put a shout out for a second for waterfall for this reason. You can run a waterfall project and with transparency and trust and high visibility, and you can run a waterfall project that aligns very nicely with Agile values. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that it's the best way to do it, but I don't know about you, but in the early 90s, I ran lots of software development projects where I practiced visual information management and had my leadership in all the time and had the customers in all the time and had a very high trust, a good relationship, and we delivered everything we said we were going to deliver it on time and on budget, and it was a waterfall project. I think waterfall gets a bad rap because there's been so many failures, and that's understandable. But I'm not sure that, to me, Agile is more about culture than it is about framework and methodology. I can point to a whole lot of Scrum projects that are not Agile. They're low trust. I won't tell you what state it was, but I was out at a state government the other day, and they were taking me through their team rooms that were all 100% Scrum. The state CIO was very proud of them being 100% Scrum. The first thing I saw was a project manager in the team room giving assignments out to all the developers. So I don't know if your listeners are all Scrum folks, but those of you that have done that, we know that Scrum teams should be self-organizing and teams should self-subscribe to the stories and the work. So in this scenario, they had a project manager on a Scrum team, which is typically frowned upon, right? And we also had them giving out assignments and command and control, managing the people and bugging them every day about the status of their work and making them give written status reports. So while they were following Scrum per se, in other words, they were doing sprint planning, 2-week sprints, retrospectives, they were doing all the ceremonies, they were using Scrum, they were the furthest thing from Agile that you could imagine. So I give a talk on this. I said Scrum isn't Agile, and here's why. Obviously Scrum has many, many benefits, and I'm a huge fan, and I recommend to all my clients. But it requires that the values and the principles be part of it, and that's not necessarily a given just because you adopt Scrum.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I've seen waterfall projects that probably worked out better than if it was ran with Scrum, especially in the ideas with things that you know what you're doing, you know what you're building. Whereas I've also seen people follow the ceremonies and methodologies of Scrum, but do it in such a hidden way that it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think you have two problems there too. Is you've got the Scrum butt crowd, right? The people that say they're doing sprints but nothing else, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. Or they're doing Scrum but they're doing all this other stuff. So that's sort of one side of the continuum. The other side is when they're doing the ceremonies exactly right and everything the way they're supposed to, but they're not agile. They don't adopt trust and visibility and transparency. So when you look at like problematic Scrum projects, those are like the two continuums, right? So what I tell my clients is, look, framework doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is how well you work together. And what matters to me more than Scrum or XP or Kanban is high trust, visibility, culture of excellence. And can you do that without Scrum? Sure. Does Scrum help you? Sure. Those things are all good, but they're not necessarily linked. And I think any kind of transformation should start with the culture. And if you want to move into a framework after that matches the culture, I'm all for that. But it's a little bit like choosing a tool before you really have defined what the tool is going to do.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right, because if you get a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right, or we're going to get an ERP. Let's buy SAP, and it's like, well, wait a minute, will SAP do what we want? Oh, yeah, it does all that. Well, then you get SAP in there and you realize it's a multi-million-dollar modification, right? Yep. So think of a framework like Scrum as a tool, and because that's kind of what it is. And the culture part of it is what I call the Agile part. So I like to separate the two in my mind. And so what you do then is you practice what I call values traceability. And that's I take the Agile values and I literally draw a line on paper from transparency to a technique or ceremony or process that my team is using and ask the question, does this technique that I'm using, let's say we're doing code reviews, is the process we're using for code reviews, is it transparent? Is it open? Some companies do what I call bench reviews. This is when just one other team member looks at your code and then approves it. And that may work for some companies. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but in a lot of environments, you want more transparency, more collaboration, more visibility than that. And so drawing a straight line from the value to how you do that code review, you might say, that sure as heck doesn't seem to be transparent and highly visible to me. We shouldn't be doing it this way, right? And so the values that your company chooses to adopt, and that may or may not be Agile values or maybe a subset or a superset, whatever they are, whatever we want our culture to be, let's trace the way we work to those values so that they're fully supported on both ends and we can achieve excellence easily rather than, pushing a rope uphill with the process we're trying to follow, right?
Yeah, and I think you outlined that pretty well in your book. I think it was near the end where you talked about tracing Agile values to ceremonies and frameworks and that kind of such. I think that really played out. I put it in a way that you can understand the idea of, this is the value. Now, what works for that?
Right, because people get hung up on process, right?
Oh, yes, and Scrum is all about people over process, right?
It sure is, but it's really about process too, mm-hmm. Right? Because, I always joke around, I spent a lot of time in the process management world too with CMMI and ISO and ITIL and those things. And one of the things I've noted is no one is more rigid and unwavering about the process than a converted Agilista, right?
Oh, absolutely.
God forbid your stand-up is 16 minutes long, right? Or what do you mean your customer came to your retrospective? That's not allowed. Well, you know what? Everything is allowed if it works for you, right? And so, I think that Agile or Scrum and XP are about process, and they're about very rigid process. I mean, when you think about Waterfall doesn't design how you have your status meetings, right? It doesn't prescribe how your customer receives deliverables. It doesn't describe in detail how planning for each iteration is done. Waterfall is much more of a what-to model, where Scrum and XP are much more how-to models. And how-to models, by definition, are more rigid and defined than what-to models. So it's kind of interesting. The Agile, this is why I got into this. That's exactly why I got into this values traceability idea, because if you trace collaboration and people over process and all that stuff down to some of the people that are executing some Scrum projects, you find that traceability doesn't really hold up. But so it is important that if you really want to have a transformation, you really want to change the culture, that you're aligned from top to bottom. And the way we do that is through this values traceability idea.
Nice. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I think I was a little bit hesitant to ever move forward with Scrum, was because I'd have people that would talk about, if you're doing it that way, then that's not really Scrum, so it's not going to work.
Yeah.
It might.
Yeah, I would say that, to all your listeners, don't worry about whether you're pure Scrum. It's not a purity test, right? I always say, methodologies aren't a suicide pact. What works for you is what works for you. And culturally, Scrum might work out of the box. Or culturally, you may say, we don't have a culture that really can support this ceremony. We need to do something different. And there's zero problem with that. It's not like you're trying to get a Scrum medal, right?
Right.
And there are such things, but like I said, focusing on the culture is really what's important. And if your culture becomes Agile, you probably will adopt something like Scrum. You probably won't adopt SAFe or some of the other more, what I call Uber structured frameworks.
Yeah, the more advanced stuff.
Well, yeah,
or larger scale stuff, I guess you would say.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate in the Agile community now about those frameworks and whether they really are Agile and whether they really do align with Agile values. And I have strong opinions, but I won't bring them up to so many listeners. It tends to get people upset. But there's a lot of discussion, even amongst what I call the titans of the industry, even amongst the Sutherlands and the Schwabers and the Ron Jeffries and those guys who are brilliant, obviously. But there's disagreement, it seems, amongst them about those frameworks. So it's definitely an open issue right now.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, before I let you go, I was wondering if you had any more advice or tips for young, fresh new managers, new leaders, people out there that are kind of moving ahead in their career and are taking that first management or team lead position, and they want to, instill that good culture of being a good leader, a strong leader for their team, but maybe don't know how to do it exactly.
Sure. Well, I'd offer up 3 books I think they should read that might help them. One book that would be really super helpful is called The Secrets of Consulting by Gerald Weinberg. And even though it's designed for consultants, it's got a whole lot of leadership wisdom in it. And it's a fairly easy read in terms of length. So I definitely read that immediately. Another one I would recommend is a book called Holacracy by Brian Robertson. Holacracy. And that's about self-organizing teams. So Holacracy is a framework for self-organization. It's a little more radical than most companies would adopt, so it hasn't really spread out that much, but it's got some great nuggets in there, especially around role management and accountability management. And then the third book is I'll plug my own book here if you don't mind.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
I wrote it specifically for them. This is Great Big Agile, an operating system for Agile leaders. And what Great Big Agile is about is a how-to book for leaders who want to create and transform into more of a self-organizing Agile type of a culture. And it's got a framework in it called the Agile Performance Hierarchy, which is a self-organizing framework for leaders to follow, and it breaks up craftsmanship into 6 different categories. So it's sort of a guide for you for how to lead and manage and operate this system of self-organization. And we even use this model for evaluating companies. Like a lot of times a company will say, we just want to know what our culture is like. It's sort of a gap analysis tool, and we use the model right out of the book for that. So it's definitely something that I would read. And between the 3 of those things, strive to live and breathe Agile, strive to live and breathe transparency and openness. And again, these things don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen by magic. How do you have visibility? Well, you have visibility by practicing visual information management, big signs on the wall, information visible to everybody. So these types of things take actions to make real, and Great Big Agile talks about all of them. So it's definitely worth your while to read it.
Yeah, I think what I really like about your book is you kind of define lots of different stuff when it comes to agile and leadership, and kind of all the different frameworks that people would need to know something about. It's in there.
Right. The last section of the book actually is 72 of the most commonly used Agile techniques, and they're all defined with roles and sequence and deliverables and everything. So it's all there. Yeah,
I think that's really important to, even if you're not using that in your company, to know about that and be familiar with that, to help making, to be known, to know what people are talking about when you hear, at a conference or in the hallway track of an event or something like that. Another thing that I wanted to mention, you briefly touched on it about the idea of transparency, and it's just something to tell the listeners that it's, nobody expects a new leader to be perfect.
Right.
And they don't want you to pretend to be perfect. They want you to be open and transparent and honest about the things you know and you don't know. You don't have to know everything, and that's okay. And, sometimes when you're that new manager, you don't want to say you don't know something or that you're uncomfortable with something. Right. But I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, one technique you might, your listeners may try here is what I call personal Agile. And I use this myself. I have a Trello board of my own backlog of all the stuff I do. And it's a 2-week board, and every 2 weeks I do kind of a retrospective with a couple of my team members to see how I did. I apply improvement opportunities. I identify things I would do differently. I do backlog grooming. I basically run my day-to-day work using personal Agile, using a tool called Trello that a lot of people probably are familiar with. It's a free tool, and you basically create a Kanban board and you run your business that way. And I do all of the techniques and ceremonies personally. And I found that what this has done for me is address that problem you just described. Is you're not always going to be right, you're not always going to be perfect, you're not always going to know what to do. But the person who masters improvement is the person who wins, right? Mm-hmm. So the only way I know how to do that is to apply these iterative and agile techniques to myself and my personal work. And I would like to see more people doing that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so my wife is she runs a PMO at a publicly traded company, and they're very, very much into Scrum and Agile, and we have a family Trello board.
Oh, okay,
and she will assign, we'll go in there. We do our family meeting once a week and kind of go through the family Trello board and keep things up to date. It's quite hilarious, but it actually works really well for our little family. So
it's amazing. Yeah, well, I wish you luck with that as your kids get older.
Yeah, they think it's normal, which is awesome.
Oh, that's cool. Well, good for you, man. That's excellent.
All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. And Jeff, I'm going to link up your book, your Twitter, and your website and podcast all up in the show notes. But how can people connect with you if they're just listening to this and they don't go to the show or they don't listen or go to the show notes and read them out and click on the links? How can people connect to you if they're just listening to this in their car?
Sure, a couple of ways. AgileCxO.org is the website. That website has good information about the models I talked about, but it also has our Agile Leadership blog and our Agile Leadership podcast, which you can listen to. And on that one, we interview CIOs and CTOs from state governments and other large Agile organizations around the world. So you can go to AgileCxO.org or on Twitter, just AgileCxO will get you there. And we're pretty active there. So we'd love to see you out on Twitter and interact with you there.
All right. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming on.
All right, John. My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Hope you guys enjoyed that conversation with Jeff Dalton about Agile leadership. I really enjoyed it, got a lot out of it. If you did, share it with a friend. Head on over to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you share things, share it with a friend. Also, subscribe if you don't subscribe, which I don't know why you wouldn't. Go ahead and subscribe. Also, leave a rating and review. I would be greatly appreciated. And I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about ratings and reviews and read a couple on the show. So one thing I told you guys I'd be doing is reading a couple of ratings and reviews as they come in so that we can kind of encourage people to leave more reviews and engage more, because that helps the audience expand. It helps more people find out about the show and all that good stuff. So we got one from Woodstock Dave last week that says, great leadership podcast. This is a good one. I had one from Adam a while back that says, great questions, great host. I'm not sure how I came across a Geek Leader, but I'm hooked. John asks great questions and casual tone is just right. He is looking to inspire every geek towards great leadership. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Woodstock Dave. Thank you, Adam, for those reviews. Greatly appreciate it. And if you would, please head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a rating and review. If you don't know how to get to Apple Podcasts because you're an Android person, then, you should buy an iPhone. No, I'm just kidding. Head to ageekleader.com. It's on the bottom of every post that we have up there, a link to go to Apple Podcasts so that you can subscribe and leave a rating and review. Be greatly appreciated. I love to get these things, love to read them, love to share them with the listeners on the show. So thanks a lot. Greatly appreciate you guys. Thanks for all you do. Thanks for sharing the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.